do you build genuine connection at work? And why does it matter? Recently, I've talked a lot about why it matters, whether you're a manager or a coworker, for things like retention and engagement. Because as a manager, you likely care a lot about making sure your team gets their jobs done, that they do those well, and that they want to stay with your organization so that you're not constantly rehiring and retraining. And whether you're a manager or a coworker, there's also so much research on the impact that you have on others, not just how they perform their jobs, but also how they feel in all aspects of their life. The ways that we work with each other, especially as a manager, but also as coworkers, impact people's health, including mental health. And so all of this research I've talked about, but in today's video, I'll talk about ways to actually build that genuine connection, especially 4 different types of leadership communication, and the one that I recommend that you try today. The first is detached leadership. So this is when, especially as a manager, you come to work, you focus on the work, you talk about the work, and it's all about the work. And often people do that, and they won't talk about things like personal lives or personal things, because managers will say, well, I don't want to do or say the wrong thing. And that's completely natural and understandable. But when you do that, and you don't have these conversations, you can be missing out on real opportunities for connection and ones that matter. Recently, I've talked about Gallup research that showed that in 2024, the study that 42% of turnover was preventable. And of those that said that the turnover could have been prevented and they would have chosen to stay at the organization, nearly a third said that the main driver that could have changed them was if they'd had more positive and less negative interactions with their manager. And so having those conversations isn't just a nice thing to do. It builds things like trust. Because when people feel like you care about them as a person and you see them as a person, then often they care more about their jobs, and it can impact how they feel during the work time and outside of it as well. And so that detached leadership and really only focusing on work can be natural, but it's not the best way to have your team members perform, but also think about that experience at work. You spend so much of your time and energy, and your team does too. And people often want to feel like they're actually human. And so the next type is leader-driven sharing. So what this is focusing on topics that really interest you. Then you think about, so you may show up and talk about your golf round, for example, or you may talk about a show that you just can't get enough of. And you're interested in it because it's interesting to you, so you think everybody else must as well. And this can be far better than not sharing anything, because when you talk about something that you're interested in, it can show. And so your team members can see you as a very real person. But the downside of this that can happen is if you focus on things just because you know they're of interest to you, you may not be thinking about your team members and how that message is actually received. So if you show up for a one-on-one and you're recounting different strokes on your golf round, like that can actually be fun to do on your end, but you may have a team member on the other side that's really trying to make the most of that time and has a checklist of 27 different things that they want to talk to you about. And so being aware of that, because I actually made a social media video about that months ago, is one of the top few videos that I've had, and people said, oh my gosh, this is so relatable. And managers don't always think about this, and even as humans, you don't think about something that interests you and that you want to talk about, how and whether it interests others on your team. And that brings us to the third type of communication, and that's common ground connection. So that's really focusing on things that you know that you have in common with other team members. So I'm recording this in summer in the Northern Hemisphere, and so maybe baseball season. So you may have kids and they're in Little League, and so you come in and you know you have a team member whose kids are on Little League as well. So you come in and you're talking about that, and it can feel great because you're talking about it, they're engaged, you're sharing it with each other. But one of the downsides to that is that that type of commonality can be great with that team member. But you may have all sorts of other team members that look at that and they think, oh, this person must be the favorite. So all of a sudden they're looking out for other things happening and wondering, okay, well, if my kid, if I had a child and they played Little League, would I get this opportunity? Or are these people talking at the ballpark outside of work, and how's that going to impact me? Because people often do focus on that. Within, what's in it for me? It's just a natural human nature. And so if you focus on things that you have in common with team members, that can be great for those that you have commonality with. But for those that don't, they can feel like the other. And so it can change the workplace dynamics, and all of a sudden with your team, You may feel like things are common good because you look forward to talking to this person. But as a leader, it's important to make sure that you're having connection and building that with all members of the team. Doesn't mean you have equal time with everyone, but just being mindful that if you're only talking about common things with certain team members, others will look at that and think, okay, maybe I just don't fit in here. So the fourth is employee-centered curiosity. And what this is asking your team members about things that you know that they're interested in. And that takes making sure that you find out what they're interested in. So asking those in conversation, having that come up, and even making notes. Sometimes people will say, what am I supposed to do? Make like different notes about each of my team members? And exactly that. Sometimes it's like if you go to a restaurant and your server is memorizing everything in their head and you may be thinking, like, are they really keeping track of everything? Nobody's a wizard. And as a manager, one of the things you can do that really shows care is exactly that. When people share things with you, not trying to keep it all in your head. And so whether it's having notes with your team members, you don't have to tell team members you're doing that, but having that and really keeping a record of, okay, this person, this happened, this is like the time of year they go on vacation, so things like that. So not only is it asking with curiosity to your team members to find out about them, but also remembering those things and bringing them up. So for example, and this is a story outside of work, but a couple years ago, it was the Taylor Swift Eras Tour, and I was taking my daughter. We had second row from the top, nosebleeds, but I was very excited about these. And I was, speaking of, at the ballpark and ran into the father of one of my son's teammates. And my daughter had mentioned, we're going to the Taylor Swift concert this weekend. And he said, what era are you going as? And I cracked up. So for those that don't know, a big thing for that tour was to go as an era, to dress as a different type of like Taylor Swift album. And I had probably very wrongly been surprised that this father would know about that and ask my daughter about that. But she lit up. So she started telling him in great detail about exactly which era she was going as. But I remember that, and it still comes up. And as I think about that with work, the commonality is I can remember conversations that I've had, not just that one at the baseball field, but at work when I had managers or coworkers that asked me questions about things maybe I'd mentioned in passing or other things that I knew probably weren't of great interest to them, but they went out of their way to ask me about it anyway. So whether it's a Bravo show that you hear people talking about, whether it's a sports team from that person's hometown, whether it's a restaurant that they mentioned that they were trying, when you ask people questions about them and focus it on them, it can feel like water in the desert. For those team members, especially those that have lived in that world of detached leadership, where they came to work and nobody was ever asking them questions about something they did, not even sharing that type of commonality. And so when you have that, it can build such connection. And so as a manager is thinking, what do you know about the different members of your team? And it's not to say to go to people and say, like, tell me about yourself. But sometimes it's having that conversation and saying, we talk a lot about work, but what are the things that you like to do outside of work? And like, feel free to share. You don't have to. And sometimes you can just do away with any awkwardness you feel by just that. But sometimes it's just learning about others and giving that opportunity for them to share. And your team members will likely vary. Some people really are hesitant to share at work, in part because they're just not used to it, or they worry, like, what's this going to be used against me? And so it takes a lot of trust. But whether it's going and talking to your team members and having those conversations to really try to build that connection about them, but then also following up with them. And so if there's something now you think, okay, I know this is of interest to a team member, bringing it up and just asking about it, or making note of something they say today and bringing it up next week. Because when you do that, you do build those things of trust and connection. And so yes, that can help people care more about their jobs, but it also can be an impact. Because as a leader, as you think about often the immediate, like we need to achieve goals, we need to achieve those right now, that's something that you need to do, but building that trust can help. But also over your career and the careers of your team, when you ask, or when I ask you now, so pretend that we are having a conversation and I say, what do you want people to remember about you? It's not likely to be about like, well, they made me really want to care about this project on this day. Like that matters. But also saying, I wanted the manager that really cared about me as a person. And so by doing these things and focused on the employee-centered curiosity, you can be that leader that not only helps to get the work done now, but also makes an impact on them for the rest of their career. So if you haven't done that, go out and try it today.